Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about, well, a really interesting guy, Bruno Bauer, a 19th century German thinker.
Yeah.
And he's someone who went through, well, like a huge transformation in his thought over his life. He starts out as this radical left Hegelian, really pushing the boundaries. But as he gets older, he ends up taking this much more, well, let's just say pessimistic and maybe even conservative turn.
Yeah, definitely a fascinating trajectory.
Yeah, so I thought maybe we could start with that early period, the left Hegelian stuff. I mean, you've got mountains of my research here. So what jumps out at you about Bauer's early career and his time with those left Hegelians?
I think what's really striking about Bauer is that he wasn't just content to, kind of reiterate Hegel's ideas.
Yeah.
He really wanted to push them to their logical extreme,
Yeah.
And you see this especially with his concept of infinite self-consciousness, which, it's not just about thinking for yourself. It's this radical idea that human reason, human self-awareness, it has the potential to completely break free from all external authority.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about, freedom from religious dogma, from the constraints of the state, even from traditional morality. It's like he's taking Hegel's idea of subjective spirit and just cranking it up to 11.
So it's almost like he's saying that the individual's capacity for reason, their ability to determine their own destiny,
Yeah.
that's the ultimate driving force in history.
Exactly. And you have to remember, this is 19th century Prussia.
Right.
A place where the state and the church held a lot of power. So for Bauer to come out and say that, individual self-consciousness is the ultimate ground of reality, well, that was pretty radical stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And so how does this idea of infinite self-consciousness, how does it play out in his critique of religion? I mean, he was pretty outspoken about his issues with Christianity, right?
Yeah. He definitely didn't hold back. He saw Christianity, he saw it as a form of alienation. This idea that people are projecting their own hopes and fears, their own power onto this external force, this God.
And that's preventing them from, fully realizing their own potential.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that he doesn't just dismiss religion as superstition.
Right.
He actually sees it as a necessary stage in the development of self-consciousness. By first projecting their power onto God, humans actually take this crucial step towards recognizing their own capacity for autonomy.
It's like this necessary detour on the road to freedom.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But then, of course, he goes on to argue that we need to move beyond that stage.
We've got to get off the detour.
Right. We have to reclaim that projected power, bring it back to the individual, and that's where true freedom lies.
Okay, so it's not just about getting rid of God. It's about reclaiming that power, that potential. Okay. No, but Bauer wasn't just critical of religion.
Right.
I mean, he also took aim at other political movements of his time, even those that claimed to be progressive.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he was a pretty fierce critic of the Prussian state.
Oh, yeah.
He saw its authoritarianism, its close ties to the church, all of that as obstacles to individual freedom. And he wasn't a huge fan of liberalism either.
Really?
Yeah, he thought it was too focused on property rights and not concerned enough with true political emancipation. And even early socialist movements didn't escape his scrutiny.
Wow.
Yeah. He felt like they failed to really grasp the importance of individual autonomy. He worried they might lead to new forms of collectivism that would, stifle freedom of thought.
So he was kind of a lone wolf, this Bauer.
Yeah, he definitely had an independent streak.
Always willing to challenge the status quo no matter where it was coming from.
Right.
It really seems like this concept of infinite self-consciousness, it was really the bedrock of his thought.
Yeah.
It informed his critiques of everything from religion to the state to, other political movements.
And you can see this most clearly in his vision for a better society. He was a strong advocate for republicanism, a system where individuals are free to participate in political life, to really shape their own destiny. It's this vision of a society built on the foundation of individual autonomy that really drove his early work.
Okay, so we've got this picture of young Bruno Bauer, a brilliant, radical thinker, deeply committed to individual freedom, and pretty much ready to take on anyone or anything that he saw as standing in the way of that freedom. But, we also know that his journey takes a pretty dramatic turn later on.
Yeah, that's right. The events of 1848, the revolutions that swept across Europe, they really proved to be a major turning point for Bauer.
That's right. And he ends up questioning a lot of those early convictions, developing a much more, shall we say, pessimistic outlook on the future.
Yeah, a lot darker.
Yeah. And that's something I definitely think we need to unpack in more detail. But I think we've covered a lot of ground here with Bauer's early work.
Yeah, for sure.
And before we move on, maybe we can just take a second to,
Sure.
kind of reflect on what we've learned so far.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Before we jump into how Bauer's thinking changes, I think it's important to really get a sense of what was going on in Europe at the time. I mean, those 1848 revolutions, they weren't just, isolated incidents. It was this wave of upheaval, this massive continent-wide push for political and social change. And for a while there, it really seemed like, maybe, just maybe, those demands were actually going to be met.
Yeah. So you've got this backdrop of revolutionary fervor, this sense of possibility hanging in the air. And Bauer, I mean, he'd been calling for radical change for years. You'd think he'd be, over the moon.
I would think, wouldn't you? But instead of being, energized by these revolutions, he actually becomes, he becomes deeply disillusioned. He sees firsthand how these revolutions fail, how those hopes for a more Republican, more egalitarian Europe, they get crushed. And often violently.
That's a pretty stark contrast to, to the optimism, that almost utopian vision he had earlier in his career.
Right.
So what happened? I mean, what do you think triggered this shift? What was it that caused him to, to turn away from those early convictions?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it was probably a combination of things, the violence and the chaos of the revolutions that definitely played a role. Remember, Bauer was a huge proponent of reason, of individual autonomy. So to see those ideals, seemingly drowned out by mob rule, well, that must have been pretty unsettling for him.
Yeah, yeah. Witnessing, the limits of human reason, the dark side of collective action. I mean, that had to be a blow to his faith in progress, right?
Definitely. But I think there was more to it than just the revolutions themselves, I mean, his later work, it gets into these really complex themes, like the decline of civilizations, the rise of global imperialism. It's like he starts to question not just the possibility of political change, but the very foundations of Western civilization itself. He goes from seeing history as this, linear progression towards greater freedom and rationality to this more cyclical view, this idea that civilizations rise and fall, rise and fall.
And this is where his biblical criticism kind of takes a new turn, right?
Exactly. He doesn't abandon it completely, but his interpretation of Christianity, it definitely changes. Remember how earlier he saw Christianity as this form of alienation where, people are projecting their power onto this external God?
Yeah.
Well, he still believes that, but he adds this whole other layer to it. He starts to see the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire as a symptom of, the decline of classical civilization. As this reflection of the weakening of reason, the rise of irrationality.
Okay, so he's connecting Christianity not just to individual psychology, but to these broader, historical and cultural forces. He's saying that Christianity kind of filled a void that was left by the decline of, traditional values and institutions.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is how he links this to the rise of mass society in his own time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he argues that just like Christianity appealed to the emotional needs of people in, the declining Roman Empire, so too do these new forms of mass movements and ideologies appeal to the anxieties and uncertainties of people living in, what he saw as a rapidly changing and disorienting world.
So it's not just about religion anymore. It's about this broader trend of, people kind of turning away from reason and individual autonomy and moving towards these, more emotional, more collective forms of belonging.
Right, exactly.
It's almost like he's, I don't know, it's like he's predicting the rise of totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century.
It's a fascinating parallel, isn't it?
Yes.
And it speaks to how insightful Bauer's analysis was. He was really concerned about what he saw as a decline in critical thinking, a rise in conformity, and he saw this as a threat to, to the very foundations of a free society.
And this is where he starts focusing on Russia, right?
That's right.
Which, I mean, it's a bit of an unexpected turn given his earlier emphasis on, individual freedom and republicanism.
It is. But it starts to make sense when you consider his growing pessimism about the future of Western civilization,
Yeah.
He's seeing Russia, with its vast territory, its authoritarian traditions, he's seeing it as this rising power that represents, well, almost like an anti-modern force.
So he's almost flipping the script, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the champion of individual autonomy is now worried about this, this powerful empire kind of shaking things up.
Exactly. He comes to believe that an era of global imperialism is inevitable,
Hmm.
marked by conflict, by the suppression of individual liberty.
Yeah.
And he sees Russia as playing this key role in this coming clash of civilizations.
Wow. It's a pretty dark vision.
It is.
But it also, I mean, it raises some important questions. Like, if Bauer is so pessimistic about the future, does he see any hope for humanity?
Right.
Does he offer any, solutions, alternatives to this seemingly inevitable decline?
Well, that's the question that drives a lot of his later work.
Right.
And while he doesn't offer any, easy answers, he does hold on to this glimmer of hope.
Really?
Yeah, despite his pessimism, he still believes in the possibility of cultural renewal.
Renewal. But how? I mean, how does he envision that happening? Given all his, anxieties about mass society, the decline of reason?
Well, this is where things get a bit more ambiguous. He doesn't lay out a clear roadmap or anything. He focuses more on the critique of, existing structures and this need for a radical break from the past. He seems to be suggesting that, the impending crisis of Western civilization, the one brought on by this clash of empires, that it could actually create the conditions for a new beginning.
So it's almost like he's saying that things have to get worse before they can get better.
Yeah, in a way.
That the very forces that he's worried about, imperialism, mass society, the decline of reason, that those might actually paradoxically create the conditions for, for a new kind of enlightenment.
That's a really good way to put it. And it points to, to the complexity, even the paradoxical nature of Bauer's later thought.
Yeah.
He's wrestling with some really, really difficult questions about the nature of history, the limits of human reason, the possibility of progress in a world that seems to be, heading towards chaos.
And as we, kind of delve deeper into his later work, I think we need to keep this tension in mind, right? This balance between his profound pessimism about the present and his enduring hope for a better future.
Absolutely.
But before we do that, I want to highlight something that really struck me as fascinating about Bauer's later religious critiques.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Well, it's his analysis of the role of religious sentiment.
Okay.
How he argues that the rise of Christianity was driven not just by dogma, but by this deeper emotional need.
Right.
Well, he sees something similar happening in his own time, but it's not just, limited to religion.
You mean like his idea that religious sentiment or something like it is actually undermining traditional beliefs from within?
Exactly. Like he points to movements like pietism with
Yeah.
their, emphasis on personal experience, inner feeling. He says they're chipping away at religious dogma.
Hmm.
And here's the thing, he sees this same dynamic at play in secular movements as well.
So he's suggesting that this turn towards sentiment, this focus on feeling and experience over, reason and doctrine, that it's not confined to religion.
Right.
It's this broader cultural phenomenon that's shaping everything, from politics to art to, social movements.
That's right. And it ties back to his anxieties about mass society, the decline of critical thinking. He sees this shift towards sentiment as both like a symptom and a cause of these broader trends. It's like he's saying that people are becoming more susceptible to emotional manipulation and less inclined to think for themselves.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful insight, and it definitely resonates with some of the challenges we're facing today.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the role of emotion and identity in, contemporary political discourse, or the way social media algorithms kind of exploit our emotional responses. Bauer was grappling with these issues, long before they became so prominent in our own time.
Yeah, wow. And this brings us to to another aspect of Bauer's later work, one that's a lot more controversial and that we need to address carefully and honestly. I'm talking about his views on nationalism and more specifically his anti-Semitism.
Right.
Yeah.
This is definitely the most troubling part of Bauer's legacy. He rejects the idea of a racially pure German nation, but he develops this this pretty racialized view of Jewish identity.
Yeah.
He argues that there's this insurmountable difference between Jews and Europeans.
So even though he was critical of racial purity as a basis for, for nationhood,
Yeah.
he still ended up applying racial categories in a way that singled out Jewish people.
Yeah.
It seems like such a contradiction given his earlier, emphasis on individual autonomy and his critiques of any system that, that limits freedom.
It is. It's a profound contradiction, and it's it's one that we can't ignore. We can try to understand the historical context, but we can't excuse the harm that his words caused.
Mhm.
It's a reminder that even brilliant minds can be susceptible to the prejudices of their time.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility to engage with their work critically, to reject the aspects that are harmful and unjust.
Well said. I think it's essential to acknowledge this darker side of Bauer's thought,
Yeah.
even as we appreciate his insights into the complexities of modernity.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up our exploration of his later work, there's one more area I want to touch on.
Okay.
His evolving views on liberalism.
Right.
I mean, he was pretty critical of it early on, but I get the sense that his perspective kind of shifted a bit in his later years.
Yeah, you're right. There is a subtle but significant shift in his thinking on this. Early on, he saw liberalism as too focused on property rights, on, individual self-interest. And he thought it neglected the broader social and political conditions that are necessary for true freedom. But as he saw the rise of mass movements and the potential for authoritarianism, he started to see liberalism in a new light.
So he was becoming more, more sympathetic to liberal ideas, recognizing their importance in, safeguarding individual rights and limiting the power of the state.
I wouldn't say he became a full-fledged liberal or anything.
Right.
But he did come to appreciate the importance of certain liberal principles, especially the rule of law and the separation of powers. He saw those as crucial bulwarks against the encroaching power of the state, the potential for tyranny.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's as if he was, recognizing the fragility of freedom in the face of these powerful social and political forces.
Yeah.
He might not have fully embraced liberalism, but he seems to have understood its value in protecting individual autonomy from the threats that he saw emerging in his time.
Exactly. It's a nuanced and complex part of his later thought.
Yeah.
But it shows, his willingness to adapt his views, to respond to the changing circumstances of the world. He wasn't afraid to rethink his, previous positions, even if it meant acknowledging the merits of ideas that he had, once criticized.
And that intellectual flexibility, that willingness to grapple with these difficult questions and to revise his own convictions. That's what makes Bauer such a fascinating and enduring figure.
Yeah.
He may not have offered any, easy answers or clear solutions, but he forced us to confront some of the most fundamental challenges of modernity, challenges that are, maybe even more relevant today than they were in his own time.
I completely agree. Bauer's legacy is, it's complex and at times it's, deeply troubling. But his work offers this profound and unsettling glimpse into the tensions and contradictions of modernity.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with these questions of individual freedom, the role of reason, the possibility of progress in a world that often seems to be teetering on the brink of chaos.
And perhaps, like he himself suggested, it's it's precisely in those moments of crisis, those periods of profound upheaval and uncertainty, that the greatest opportunities for renewal and transformation emerge. It's kind of wild, how much Bauer's worries about mass society and the decline of reason, they feel really relevant to what's happening today.
Yeah.
Like he almost saw it coming. All the misinformation, the rise of populism, the way people are losing trust in institutions.
Yeah, it's amazing how much his writing from over a century ago speaks to the things we're dealing with now.
Yep.
Like those warnings about emotional manipulation, about groupthink, the way people latch on to simple answers for, really complex problems.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how he connects those anxieties to his changing views on liberalism. I mean, remember how critical he was of liberalism early on?
Right.
But then, later on, he seems to develop a kind of respect for some liberal principles.
Yeah, there's a definite shift there. He never fully embraced liberalism, but he did start to appreciate the importance of certain liberal institutions and values,
Yeah.
particularly those that, protect individual rights and limit the power of the state. He saw the rule of law and the separation of powers as as really important safeguards against tyranny.
So it's like he's, coming to terms with how fragile freedom really is, how we constantly have to, defend it against the forces that want to undermine it.
Right.
And maybe he saw some aspects of liberalism as, as a way to protect that freedom.
I think that's a good reading of it. He wasn't naive about liberalism's limits, but he also understood its value in preserving space for individual autonomy and critical thinking, which were, things he considered essential.
Yeah, and that space for critical thinking, that's what he champions throughout his work.
Yep.
Even when he's, at his most pessimistic.
Right.
He's worried about where society is headed, but he never loses faith in the individual mind's ability to question, to challenge, to find new ways of understanding things.
That's what makes him such a such a compelling figure. Even when he's wrong in, in interesting ways.
Right.
He makes us confront these uncomfortable truths, rethink our assumptions, really dig deep into the complexities of history and, the human condition.
And in a way, his pessimism itself is kind of like a call to action. He's not just like complaining about the decline of civilization,
Yeah.
right? He's challenging us to resist it, to find new ways to cultivate reason, to defend individual liberty, to actually, build a more just and humane world.
That's a good way to think about his legacy. He's not giving us easy answers, but he is reminding us that the future isn't, set in stone. We have a responsibility to shape it, to fight for the things we believe in, to never stop questioning and striving for something better.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Bruno Bauer, I think we can agree that he was a thinker who defied easy labels.
Oh, yeah.
He was a radical, a critic, a pessimist, and, maybe even a reluctant optimist in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
He was, definitely flawed. But he was also brilliant, insightful, and, ultimately committed to searching for truth, however difficult that might be.
Bruno Bauer was a product of his time, but he was also a thinker who transcended his time. He was asking these questions that are, still relevant today.
Yeah.
His work shows us the power of ideas, how important critical engagement is, and how we need to keep fighting for a world where, where reason and individual freedom can flourish.
That's our deep dive on Bruno Bauer. Hopefully, give you some things to think about.
Yeah, and maybe even left you a little bit unsettled.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.